I belong to a generation in Portugal that la deuxième langue, c'était le français. Mais enfin, des concessions. We have to thank Caixa Geral de Depósitos and the president, cher ami, dear friend, Paulo Macedo. We have to thank, obviously, to the two speakers, Pascal e Vítor Bento. Isto é uma organização conjunta do Centro Nacional de Cultura, do Grêmio Literário e do Círculo Essa de Queiroz. A ordem dos trabalhos vai ser breves apontamentos iniciais. Começaremos com o Sr. Presidente, com o Paulo Macedo, Presidente da Caixa, outro breve apontamento do nosso Presidente do Grêmio e um breve apontamento também do organizador Zé Sarmento. Prometemos que isto será, para não abandonarem a sala, não exorbitará mais que aproximadamente 15 minutos e enquadrará, digamos, a temática. Obrigado a todos, Sr. Presidente da Caixa.
Como a maior parte sabe, e temos aqui alguns convidados estrangeiros, as conferências de casino originais representaram um momento de mudança na sociedade portuguesa. Causaram uma crise política e foram um ponto de viragem. Não é com certeza algo tão radical que agora se pretende, mas é crucial continuar a refletir. Retomemos as origens, não das conferências originais, mas da Europa, dessa Europa que está hoje no centro do debate. A nossa Europa, e só aqui um breve parênteses, tem um início, como sabemos, poético e romântico. A Europa era uma princesa que vivia na Ásia. Zeus, o pai dos deuses, apaixonou-se por ela e decidiu raptá-la. Por isso, transformou-se num touro, forte e majestoso, e aproximou-se da Europa. A princesa subiu para o dorso do touro, que voou para Creta e ali revelou a sua identidade e fez da Europa a primeira rainha de Creta. Que o nome do nosso continente mergulhe nas suas raízes na Ásia é tão significativo como sabemos que os primeiros hominídeos vieram de África. Temos assim que a Europa é uma terra de confluências míticas, culturais e antropológicas. Há um conhecido poema de António Gedeão que traduz bem esta ideia. Minha aldeia é todo o mundo me pertence. Aqui me encontro e confundo com gente de todo o mundo, que a todo o mundo pertence. O poema intitula-se A Minha Aldeia e António Gedeão antecipava o mundo global que um dia havia de chegar. Não podemos recriar nem reviver a mitologia, por muito belas que as suas narrativas nos soem. Tal como não podemos ficar amarrados ao passado sem ter uma perspectiva de um mundo que aos nossos olhos e todos os dias se transforma. Certamente que não é esse o caminho, mas também não podemos esquecer o legado do nosso continente. Aquele que simbolicamente começou como uma história de paixão no dorso de um touro. Reside nesta confluência de tradição, do passado, da inovação, do questionamento, da permanente procura, que novas conferências do casino ganham nova importância. A pergunta formulada no programa, será que caminhamos para o empobrecimento e para o caos no continente, ganha nestes dias porque passamos maior equidade e pertinência. É importante que o Círculo Essa de Queiroz, o Grêmio Literário e o Centro Nacional de Cultura estejam no centro desta iniciativa. Precisamos de boas iniciativas e das entidades corretas para as concretizarem. Associo-me como Presidente da Comissão Executiva da Caixa Geral de Depósito ao vosso programa. A discussão em torno de Portugal e a Europa é-nos crucial. É sempre bom recordar que Portugal é um país virado ao Atlântico, mas de matriz mediterrânica. Tal como a Europa da mitologia, estamos num continente, mas vivemos virados para a África e para a América. Várias vezes partimos e muitas vezes regressamos. E podemos, pela nossa vivência multicultural, ter um papel agregador e de construção de pontes. É certo que quando as primeiras conferências de casino tiveram lugar, ainda não havia Caixa Geral de Depósitos. Surgimos 5 anos mais tarde. Mas é também um facto que assumimos um papel de proximidade das comunidades portuguesas, estando onde estão os nossos compatriotas. Aí podemos claramente dizer que, libertos do passado, de passados coloniais, podemos lançar novos caminhos de diálogo e de construção de futuro. E podemos ajudar a combater as ameaças de caos e de empobrecimento, que não são, como sabemos, ameaças só nossas, mas seguramente são ameaças globais. Precisamos de criar neste combate pela Europa, pelo futuro e pela civilização, respostas concretas. E precisamos de projetos em que os cidadãos se revejam. Passa por aí o sucesso pela continuação da resolução dos problemas que nos são comuns, como refere o programa. Passa por aí o sucesso do nosso continente aos mais variados níveis. É neste binómio de reflexão e de ação que queremos avançar. É desse binómio que esperamos novas e importantes respostas que todos precisamos. E eu relembro o que me ficou uma parte significativa das minhas aulas de português do ensino secundário foi precisamente da geração de 70, a geração que fez as Conferências do Casino. Por isso, a melhor sorte e os parabéns.
Muito boa tarde. Cumprimento o Presidente da Caixa Geral de Depósitos, Dr. Paulo Macedo, e agradeço o amável acolhimento. Cumprimento os oradores, Pascal Lamy, Vítor Bento, o moderador do debate, José Sarmento, os organizadores, Pedro Rebelo de Sousa e Guilherme de Oliveira Martins, que hoje não está presente. Excelências, cumprimento todos os presentes, excelentíssimas senhoras, excelentíssimos senhores. O Círculo Essa de Queiroz, o Grêmio Literário e o Centro Nacional de Cultura são instituições de ordem cultural, englobando todas as atividades que levam à produção de um pensamento reflexivo, seguindo os propósitos das Conferências do Casino. As novas conferências têm tido e têm hoje a pretensão de pensar o presente com atenção ao futuro de Portugal e da Europa. Assistimos incrédulos ao derrubamento do equilíbrio político que nos deu anos de entendimento e paz em Portugal e na Europa. É incompreensível ver o curso dos acontecimentos no leste da Europa e o que esteve na origem deste estado de guerra e destruição com a invasão de um país soberano, motivado pela ambição imperialista de um político autocrático. Portugal, integrado na comunidade europeia, sente a invasão com preocupação, associando-se à ajuda urgente e necessária para defender a liberdade territorial da Ucrânia. Está em causa a liberdade da Europa como um todo, ameaçada nos seus valores e princípios democráticos. Diz-nos a história que os déspotas caem face à luta e resistência dos povos insubmissos. Esperemos que tal aconteça, tendo em atenção os novos perigos que podem destruir a humanidade. Pensar o futuro exige a reflexão do presente em Portugal, na Europa e no mundo. Muito obrigado.
Muito boa tarde a todos. Muito obrigado por terem vindo a mais uma das nossas conferências. Portanto, esta é a terceira. Fizemos uma primeira precisamente sobre a guerra na Ucrânia. Fizemos uma segunda sobre um tema que muito preocupa as pessoas, que é o papel dos humanos depois da inteligência artificial. E esta terceira é sobre um tema que é essencial para todos nós, não só para a Europa, mas no concreto para Portugal. Quando nós escolhemos este conjunto de temas, a nossa preocupação era levar as pessoas a pensar sobre coisas que de facto vão impactar o nosso futuro. Não quer dizer que sejam os únicos problemas com que nós como sociedade nos debatemos. Há muitos outros, mas há muitos outros que podem ser resolvidos por nós, portanto, no quadro da nossa democracia portuguesa. Há, por outro lado, um conjunto de temas que nos ultrapassam, que são ventos que vêm de fora, sobre os quais a nossa capacidade, portanto, de ação é muito reduzida, mas que isso não quer dizer que devamos perante eles não pensar, portanto, porque quando esses movimentos nos caírem em cima, portanto, é do nosso interesse que nós não só percebamos o que é que está em causa, como saibamos como nos comportar para melhor nos defender. O tema de hoje é a Europa. No século XX, no espaço de 3 décadas, entre 1914 e 1945, as nações da Europa conseguiram o triste feito de, por 2 vezes, se autodestruírem e com uma intensidade nunca vista. O balanço desta loucura humana traduziu-se em dezenas de milhões de mortos e na devastação de cidades e infraestruturas. A partir dos anos 50 começa a ganhar corpo um conjunto de iniciativas, a partir de Jean Monnet e de outros, que foi chamando a atenção de que o sentimento da primazia nacional teria que dar lugar, ainda que pouco a pouco, ao entendimento de que os problemas com que cada um se debatiam, afinal, eram comuns a todos. E essa é a grande novidade do processo de integração europeia que começa nos anos 50. Quando, em 1986, Portugal se juntou ao projeto europeu, a Europa estava já a entrar na idade adulta. Não acompanhámos, nem soubemos, das dores de parto, do que foi a derrota do projeto de construção da Europa da defesa, que ainda hoje não existe, no que foi a primeira crise séria entre o ideal federalista de Jean Monnet e a elegia nacionalista de Gaulle. Apenas começámos a ouvir vagamente as questões sobre as finanças europeias, porque quando Portugal entrou no projeto europeu, este preparava-se já para entrar a um nível superior, o que aconteceu sob a liderança inspirada de Jacques Delors e com o forte apoio de Mitterrand e de Kohl. Sobre o que foi esse relançamento europeu, que trouxe o mercado único, a moeda única e o Erasmus, ninguém melhor para nos contar do que se passou do que o nosso convidado de hoje, Pascal Lamy, que foi à data chefe de gabinete do Presidente da Comissão, Delors. Nós entramos em 86, mas dada a ignorância que havia em Portugal quanto aos objetivos e quanto ao passado do projeto europeu, a nossa entrada não se fez sem equívocos. Muitos de nós se lembram ainda de que certos políticos portugueses, nos anos 80 e 90, apelavam à resistência face às perigosas ideias federalistas e rezavam à memória sagrada dos nossos heróis medievais como ilustração do caminho que afinal deveríamos seguir. Acho que temos poucas dúvidas de que só a insanidade e a ignorância podem fazer hoje alguém acreditar que a vida medieval tenha sido o momento mais sublime da história da humanidade e, em concreto, da história da Europa. Acontece que a mesma vertigem retrógrada hoje faz parte das sociedades polaca e húngara. Resta-nos esperar que esta doença, própria da idade infantil, seja rapidamente ultrapassada para bem de todos nós. Se o sucesso do projeto europeu devolveu à Europa a relevância económica global e um soft power invejável, não devolveu o poder militar. E hoje, os reequilíbrios das superpotências militares, os desafios do clima e das migrações e o populismo alimentado pelos inimigos da democracia e da força europeia fazem-nos duvidar sobre o futuro. Será que não temos direito à esperança? Será que afinal caminhamos para o empobrecimento e para o caos? O objetivo da nossa reunião, como podem esperar, é que os nossos convidados nos ajudem a ver para além destes problemas, olhando em frente. Por isso vamos ter a Pascal Lamy, que nós agradecemos muito a sua presença na sua vida super ocupada. Pascal Lamy é um diplomado das mais distintas escolas francesas, o HEC, Sciences Po, ENA. Fez parte da presidência de Delors, foi comissário europeu e foi a seguir diretor-geral da Organização Mundial do Comércio, onde supervisionou a entrada da China, que é outro momento charneira da nossa história recente. É um grande privilégio ter Pascal Lamy connosco, que na sua agenda muito sobrecarregada acabou por encontrar alguns minutos para vir até Lisboa. Para discutir os desafios da Europa, temos que lhe acrescentar a perspectiva dos países de pequena e média dimensão, apesar de, no nosso caso, com uma história milenar, e por isso temos o orgulho de poder contar com a participação de um dos mais brilhantes economistas portugueses, o Dr. Vítor Bento, que tem uma carreira no mundo da finança, seja na perspectiva do Estado, mas também dos bancos e dos outros operadores. O Dr. Vítor Bento é, como sabemos, autor de algumas das mais desassombradas análises sobre as nossas preocupações como país. Eu vou pedir ao Pascal Lamy e ao Vítor Bento para subirem, onde irão dizer de sua justiça sobre se de facto temos futuro ou não temos futuro, como é que eles veem os riscos que neste momento condicionam a vida da Europa, e depois no final daremos com certeza algum tempo para Q&A.
Good afternoon, good evening. Many thanks for inviting me today and for these introductions. It's a very big pleasure for me to be back in Portugal, in Lisbon, and to see quite a number of good friends in this room. Having heard the name of the law, I also need to transmit to this audience a very special, friendly greeting for him, from him, when I told him I was invited in Lisbon to discuss the state of play of European integration. He was very happy about this. And I can tell you, he is now 70 years old, and the moments of happiness, of course, are not as many as in the past. So your invitation was a moment of pleasure for him. Now, back to this evening's topic. As was recalled, I've been involved in European issues more or less in the core or in the periphery of the system for the last 40 years. And I believe the European Union is in a moment of crisis, a major crisis, and probably the biggest crisis this unprecedented process of economic and political integration has never gone through since the inception of this process 70 years ago. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia has resulted in a full-blown war on the European continent, and the EU is on the side of one of the fighters, Ukraine, who intends to defend its independence, and we are on their side. It's the first time since 70 years that the EU is on the side of a war. Now, not a direct war, for reasons which we know, but a war, the outcome of which will have a major influence on the future of European integration. I always remember this quote by Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the European Union, who said that the EU, the Union of Europeans, will be built by crisis, and it will be the result of the Europeans coping with this crisis. And I think this is absolutely true when you look at the sort of medium, long-term history of the European Union, which is why this moment is, in my view, and with my experience, and with the privilege of being very old, which give you a different sense of time, is a very crucial one. The European edifice, which has been constructed bit by bit, with some moments of accelerations, some moments of deceleration, no moment of regression except for the Brexit, for very specific reasons. This edifice will be either stronger or weaker as a result of the invasion of Ukraine and of this crisis. And what I want to do very rapidly is to go with you through a few reasons why one can believe EU will emerge stronger on this long-term integration process, but also some reasons why it could emerge weaker. The beams of the European edifice are working. Like, that's an expression by carpenters. Now, what are the few reasons why one can believe that the reasons for EU to become stronger, more solid, are there? I think there are, let me put it simply, three of these reasons. The first one is that for the last 20 years, the EU has been rather good at coping with crisis, which, by the way, always came from the outside, never from the inside, except for political divisions with Hungary and Poland, which should not be neglected, but the biggest shock came from the outside, whether it's the 2008 financial crisis, whether it's the refugee crisis, whether it's the COVID crisis. In each of these cases, after moments of hesitation, the EU took a stance which led to a reinforcement of the European integration process, and the first steps of the reaction to the Ukrainian war were of the same vein. The EU manifested a very rapid and strong sense of unity and determination that although we would not be direct belligerents, we would fight this on the side of Ukraine. This is a moment of political integration. We did not do this for economic reasons. We did that for political reasons. And by the way, the manner in which Ukrainian refugees have been greeted in Europe, of course, depending on geography, more or less, but was a sort of evidence of that at a time where it was not obvious. The second reason why one can believe that this is a moment that prepares further steps in integration is that it confirms a view that had appeared for the last, let's say, 10 years, that the EU integration process was triggered by the necessity of a larger strategic autonomy. The fact that all this crisis came from the outside, including the invasion of Ukraine, which took us by surprise, leads to the notion that the EU has to be better at integrating in protecting its population from outside risks. There had been a conversation about this in recent years. It's a formidable confirmation that we have to, in the future, take as a duty a better protection of our citizens and of our allies on the European continent. The third reason, and I don't want to expand too much because of time constraints, the third reason is that the necessity to sever Europe from Russian gas, which is one of the major consequences of the invasion and our reaction to invasion with economic sanctions, will very likely accelerate an energy transformation around the Green Deal, where Europe has been and still remains a leader worldwide, while recognizing that this transition is not an easy path, but the reasons for moving in the direction are bigger now that we have to do without Russian gas than before. Those are positive reasons. There are more negative reasons in that this Russian invasion of Ukraine triggers elements of an economic crisis, elements of a political crisis, and elements of a geopolitical crisis. Elements of an economic crisis, we've seen that in the aftermath of the invasion, with prices on energy, food, which have accelerated an already present stream of inflation, which is hurting European populations, and notably, because it's about energy and food, the poorer parts of our populations, hence a sort of social and political shock, short term. The reality is that we seem to have adjusted reasonably well to the energy and food part of this, but we will now have to live, notably because of this new energy environment, with a very serious problem of competitiveness for the European economy on energy. All things equal, the projections are that for the 10 or 15 years to come, we will have to pay our electricity roughly 10, 20, or 30%, depending on who you listen to, than the US or China. And this is a handicap which we will have to live with and cope with, which is a negative shock on the European economy. We've also had a series of political tensions appearing on the occasion of the invasion of Ukraine. Most of them were already there before, but under the surface. While the decision by Mr. Putin has triggered a surfacing of a number of these elements. Let me take 2 or 3 examples. East-West tensions within the European Union. There is a part of the European Union around Poland, the Baltic states, who feels, rightly or wrongly, probably largely rightly, that their view on the risks of a negative development with Russia, as diplomats would say, were underestimated by others. And it is true that for a long time, they've been making this point, and notably on the western part of the continent, and notably Germany and France, have looked at that with some disdain. And this creates a tension, because they believe they were right, we didn't listen to them, and this triggers a sort of crisis. Within this Eastern and Central Europe, by the way, you also have tension, notably if you look at the divisions between Hungary and Poland on the reaction to Russia, with Hungary playing a very specific role, roughly not moving with the rest or negotiating waivers that allow them to pretend they are with the rest, but in reality do not apply the sanctions. Second tensions it has created is, and this is pretty obvious, between France and Germany. The reality is that for the last 50 years, there are a few issues on which Germany and France never agreed, and that the invasion of Ukraine has outlined the three precise areas where they do not agree, which is energy, defense, and EU finance. And the reconstruction of Ukraine will raise major EU finance issues, which are starting to be discussed. Energy-wise, the problem of the discrepancy between France and Germany, with France with nuclear energy and Germany having exited, creates very serious tensions, notably in the reform of the European energy market. And of course, on defense, the old problem of how transatlantic should be or not be a European defense has resurfaced. And this is a bone of contention, not just between France and Germany, where it's the most obvious, but also with many other countries on the European continent. Let's move to another element where EU might exit this war with a weaker situation, which is the geopolitical environment of this war, east-west between US and China, and north-south between EU and what we now call the Global South, which I prefer to call simply the South. It's clear that the war in Ukraine cannot be analyzed nor separated for a larger geopolitical rivalry between US and China, and that the reasons why China supported Russia have to do with this geopolitical rivalry, and the reason why the US are supporting Russia also has to do with this rivalry, and this is a problem for the EU. Where are we between US and China in the future? We obviously are nearer to the US than China for many, many reasons, but how much will we follow the US in the way they manage their rivalry with China has a lot to do with the outcome of this war. And this is an open question for us. The other geopolitical fragility which has appeared is in the North-South relations. Europeans thought that the rest of the world, notably on the south side, like the Europeans. We witnessed that a large part of the South do not like the Europeans for a variety of reasons, which I don't have time to describe. We might go back to that. The reality is that the Russia-China narrative on the war has penetrated minds in the South much more than our narrative, which is it's invasion, it's an aggression, it's totally contrary to any international law. This element of our argument has not prevailed so far, and we are now in a weaker situation vis-à-vis the South. And the best evidence of that, by the way, is what happened for the last 3 days in Brussels with the EU-LATAM summit. That was, in a way, totally rotten by the fact that a number of Latin American countries do not want to write that they have a problem with Russia invading Ukraine, whereas we cannot agree with anything that doesn't say that. So, elements on the side of optimism. I'm among those who deeply believe the European integration is an absolute necessity looking at 50 or 100 years from now. It is a civilization which we need to ensure. We need to hedge against mostly the US-China rivalry. But, as I said, the beams are working, the dice are rolling. My answer, I have an answer in my heart, but my answer in my brain for the moment is more integrative. I'm not sure where this will result. I think there are two major elements, and that's my conclusion to my own question. The first one, of course, is the fate of the war. Depending whether Ukraine wins, and Ukraine winning is a very complex conversation among geopoliticians and diplomats, of course, but there will be a winner and a loser. It may not be next year, it may not be 5 years from now, it may be next month, you never know. There will be a winner and a loser, and whether we will win or not will have a major impact on our future, not least on the way the Europeans look at themselves and the way the rest of the world looks at the Europeans. This is unknown. I mean, I'm working with quite a lot of people on this Ukraine war and its geopolitical and geoeconomic consequences. Most of my military good sources, when I ask them, tell me, look, I have no answer beyond 3 weeks from now. And I'm afraid this is a reality, even if this is not what I believe we hope. The second decisive element will be how the EU enlarges as a result of this crisis. A new enlargement of the European Union is underway. It was not really underway before Putin pushed on the aggression button. It is now underway and switching in the 10 to 15 years to come from 27 member states to 36 member states is a long, new journey. And whether we will succeed in this journey or not will also be a large part of the answer of whether the Union will emerge stronger or weaker. So, answer 10 years from now, inshallah.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to the organization for inviting me and for giving me the privilege to share the stage with Pascal, who has said almost everything about what is to say about Europe. So I will try to move a little bit to the sidelines. But let me start by picking up on your last phrase about the 10 years from now on and so on. Just to give a word of caution and, in a way, a word of humility from a perspective of an analyst, which is that an analyst in general knows much less than he would like to know, in particular when it regards the future. It's not easy, of course, it's not easy to foresee the future. Many times we see some people that have really make a forecast that turns out to be right. Most of the time, not always, fortunately, most of the time is just a sheer of luck. I mean, he made a bet, and the wheel of fortune brought that result, but it did not have necessarily more foresight than the one that made a different bet, but the circumstances evolved differently. Because the path of history is determined by a dialectic between circumstances, most of them exogenous, and the wills of the people that interact with those circumstances. And that interaction in itself, it creates other circumstances, some endogenous, but some of them unintended, and that influence the future. So just to say that what we control is much less than what we don't control, which means that we are very good in explaining the path we are very good in creating frameworks to make the path to look very rational and to have a kind of a line of development that is very rational. But the events of the future might really lead us to revise that narrative in order to integrate the new facts, which means that the narrative that we had previously, that was so rational, turns out not to be. But nevertheless, we explained very well the past, but about the future, we need luck. And based on that, I remember the story of an old Prime Minister of England. I think it was Lord Palmerston, but I'm not sure if it was himself. In a talk with someone, the journalist, and the journalist asked him, Mr. Prime Minister, what do you fear most that can disturb your plannings, that can interfere, in what you foresee for the future? And the Prime Minister replied, well, my boy, events, it's what I fear most. Which means that, in fact, the events are unpredictable and they can disturb the most well-prepared plan. So take that into consideration when you evaluate what I'm about to say, in particular about the future. Well, I will not repeat the analysis of Pascal, with which I agree with almost everything, if not with everything, but try to give a kind of an appraisal about Europe. First of all, it's not easy to talk about Europe because we don't know very well what is Europe, because there are many definitions of Europe, even in terms of geography. I've come across with many international statistics that put different countries in different places. For instance, there are some statistical databases that include Kazakhstan in Europe, so Europe goes as far as Kazakhstan. There are others, for instance, from the United Nations that include Cyprus in Asia. And just to give an example, and then we will have to ask Turkey, is Turkey European? Is it Asian? The same with Russia, and so on. So, and if we look at many organizations, some of them even include Israel in European assessments, like Eurovision or the UEFA Cups. They include Israel. So it's a kind of a very volatile definition. So that is the first. Second, we can restrict the analysis to the European Union. But to make a comparison across the time, it's rather difficult because even the European Union has been, I would not call it volatile, but a variable institution, either enlarging, either shrinking, as it happened recently, which makes it difficult to make comparisons, at least statistical comparisons, across the time. We are not comparing the same thing. Of course, we have data. Well, I can present you GDP data for the 27 countries of the European Union in 1995 or even before that, but that was not European Union. It's an addition of numbers, but it's not the same reality. So this is to give just some indications of the difficulties that the analyst has to analyze Europe. But if we look at the numbers, in fact, what we look is that Europe has been losing ground in the world comparisons. It is now the third world economic bloc. It has been surpassed by China. It has also lost ground vis-à-vis the United States. But that also depends very much on the kind of unities you use for comparison. For instance, today, this morning, the Radio Observador had a forum about the comparison between Europe and the United States, when Europe was lagging behind very fast, in particular since the last crisis. And because I heard that, I was looking at the numbers, to the statistical numbers, in order to confirm that idea. And in fact, the idea is right when you compare in US dollars, which was the case. But if you compare in purchasing power parity, which is best unit of comparison when you want to compare living standards, or if you compare in euros. So the distance is much smaller, because during that time the US dollar strengthened very much, and that had a very strong influence in this deviation of the behaviors between Europe and the United States. So all in all, Europe has lost some ground, but not very much, so to speak. And then it depends if we are looking just at quantities or also at quality. There is, though, one indicator that I believe is the best indicator when you had to compare countries, when you had to compare regions, when you have to compare cultures, whatever you want to compare. There is an indicator which I think is the most revealing of all of them, which is the movements of people. Where people go to and where people go from. These are the indicators what are really the best, what the people in general consider to be the best places that they would like to live in, and they are willing to sacrifice sometimes even their lives in order to arrive to that kind of idealized country or paradise. And where are the countries that want to get away from? And on these indicators, Europe is clearly a destination preferred, together with the United States and some other Western cultural countries like Australia and New Zealand. They are the main destinations of migrations. Apart from these countries, only the petro countries, but for reasons that you can imagine, it's not necessary for cultural reasons. It's just to make a quick buck in order to return home. But in order to stay, to adopt, to elect as a new home is clearly Europe and the United States. And as I think we should be very happy with this outcome, and this supersedes all the analysis that we can try to make based on GDP or things like that. But even, I mean, if you look at GDP, Europe as a bloc is one of the richest. If we look at stocks, the wealth stocks, Europe is perhaps still the wealthiest bloc in the world. Even, I mean, if in terms of the flows, which is the GDP creation year by year, if in the United States is faster, but in Europe, due to the accumulation of the past, the level of the wealth accumulated is still bigger than the rest of the world. The item where Europe is losing relative position, not absolute position, but is relative position, is the share of human capital of the world. In fact, mostly due to the progress made by China, not only China, but mostly by China. So the share of human capital in Europe is now slightly lower than it was 40 or 50 or 50 years ago. So in all, so Europe is still very successful. But if we look at some elements of the dynamics, there are, of course, some variables that should get us concerned about the potential future losses that it might provide to. One is, in fact, the position that Europe has in the competition for the leading technologies. Europe is becoming an empty space in a competition where it emerges mostly on one side, the United States, and China on the other side. And Europe is really, I would not call it necessarily a black hole, but it's becoming an empty space. There is no leading. Europe does not lead any new technologies. It's still a leader of the old technologies, adapted to modern times. We still produce the best cars with combustion engines. We still produce the best cars, of course, with much more modern technologies than 50 or 60 years ago, but they are still the same kind of cars. But in terms of the digital technologies, there is really a lack of leadership in Europe, and there is Europe risks to succumb to the domination, even in terms of geopolitical projection of power. This is perhaps if not the biggest weakness of Europe, at least one of them. And now I'm moving to perhaps a more challenging elements. And I think that one of the reasons why Europe is lagging behind in this competition, it's economic organization. The economic organization and the economic philosophy that presides to this organization. Well, we all have heard very much, very laudatory comments about the single market of Europe. The single market of Europe basically is a myth. There is no single market. There is a collection of fragmented national markets that are fragmented by internal regulations, by language, by tradition, by culture, by many things. But they are also kept divided by a vision of the competition policies and the state-aid policies that has limited the development of really big European corporations. I will come a little bit to that. The rules that prevail today, I have serious doubts that it would be possible to have a project like the Airbus. You remember the Airbus was a project where Europe was able to compete mostly with the United States in the production of aircraft. It was a very successful project that produced very good results, but I doubt if that would be possible today. And also to give you another example, I'm a consumer of Kindle books. I only read today for economic reasons mostly Kindle books, but I'm unable to buy Kindle books in Spain or in any other European market. I'm forced to buy them in the United States. Why? Because of the regulations that exist that prevent me to do that. I cannot even, and I search and I can find that some books are cheaper in Spain, and I try to overcome those difficulties that are imposed upon me, but I'm prevented from doing that, and this is also a very good example that the single market does not work. But perhaps the best expression why the single market, why this fragmentation is difficult to overcome is the contradiction in terms of this economic organization, which is the existence of national competition authorities. The existence of national competition authorities is the negation of the single market. Once you have national authorities, they have to have an object, and their object is to preserve their business, to preserve their purpose, and their purpose is to protect their reserved market, and therefore all analysis that they make is based on their market, and they are very much shy of integrating in their, and I have that as experience as in my professional life. They refrain from using the European market as the reference market for their decisions. Therefore, they do not allow any European corporation to get enough size to compete in the world arena. Because to compete in the world arena, you need to get size. And I don't know of any company that was able to gain size everywhere without being in their domestic market first. So they have to dilute the fixed costs in their domestic market, and then they go abroad competing on marginal costs, which is what the American companies or the Chinese companies do, coming into Europe, competing at marginal costs. While in Europe, no company is allowed to get enough size to be able to dilute the fixed costs to compete with these American and Chinese companies, and therefore this is a serious limitation for Europe to be a serious competitor in the new technologies in the global arena. Also, but I exhausted my time. I can come back to that, so I don't want to extend too much my talk on this. But also the exaggerated, strict policies on state aid also limit the possibility of development of some industrial capabilities in Europe. While then, when you compete with China or even look at United States. They are now developing a program of serious state assistance to their companies in order to make them resistant to the competition of China. In Europe, that is considered a kind of a sacrilege, and therefore, so we trying to be the good guys. We will get in we'll become unable to be a competitor with these two blocks that should be our competitors. And I'm afraid that if we don't change this approach, if we don't start to have a European economic vision and have a European economic development policy, I'm afraid that we will keep being a kind of an empty space or a black hole in the world competition. Well, I would have something more to say, but I hope that we'll have time in further rounds. Thank you.
I'll react briefly, and of course, then we will have to interact with you all. But I'll react briefly on three of the points you made. First one is to say that I agree on the point you made about the relative positioning of the European Union in the world, with this sort of rapid SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, which you made. As far as I am concerned, the real problem we have is that we have a worrying trend with, on the one side, an aging population, which is your point about human capital, and on the other side, a slower than elsewhere path to innovation. And it's these two things together that create a sort of scissors effect, which is dangerous, insofar as the growth of an economy is very roughly the sum of production factors increase, and we have a production factor that decreases, which is labor, on the one side, and on the other side, productivity, i.e. the way you combine your production factors. Today and tomorrow, 2/3 roughly of productivity will come from innovation. So the fact that we have a slowing increase of the labor production factor, whereas we have a good capital base, even if it is not as mobile and agile as it is in the US, and our lack of innovation is, I think, the real problem. And the fact is that we invest less than US or China, or Korea, or Japan in innovation, not really in research, because EU science-wise is still very much at the right level, but it's the translation from brain juice to a market dynamism, which is the real issue. And on this, we have to be better. And by the way, this is one of the areas where I believe we missed a large part of the benefits of EU integration. Today, if you look at public support for research, overall, 15% is done at EU level and 85% is done at national level. And of course, at a time where you have to invest a lot, whether it's about biotech, whether it's about semiconductors, or whether it's about green technology, this lack of economies of scale is a big handicap. The good news is that we could remedy that The bad news is that governments are still very much reluctant to put more common money in the EU pool. So, but overall, I agree on this point. I'm not of the same indulgence on your second point, which is your sort of basic criticism of the way the EU integration has processed, and notably with the single market. A, because it has worked. It has been a big success in European economic growth for the last 30 years. The creation of the internal market has led to economies of scale, if you combine it with the euro, which have produced efficiencies that translate into productivity. And this is the numbers are there, with, of course, an important difference between goods and services. We have a relatively achieved internal market on goods, although we do not have that in services. And given the combination of goods and services in economic growth, which is roughly 1/3, 2/3, even if we are now on average lower than 1/3 in Europe, this is a problem. And we know the reasons for that, which again, like in research, are purely political. The reason why the EU was not able to integrate enough in services market was because of national resistances from an integration that would have led to a reshuffle of labor, which is one of the reasons why we haven't done enough. So it has worked, and part of the criticism you make of the previous model, which was true very much market-driven, although it was, and that was the real vision of Delors, very much accompanied by budget transfers from richer regions to poorer regions, which helped poorer regions to address a number of comparative disadvantages in competition, given that the single market was opening competition. There is, I believe, some truth in what you say, but this is changing. If you look at what's happened for the last 5 years, we have an industrial policy. We have a clearly firmer trade policy than used to be the case before, and more to come with the green transition, the digital transition, and possibly the impact of the Ukraine war on the European economy. So I think there has been a shift, and we now are with a different mix between a sort of market-driven economic policy and a more welfare or state-driven, and no coincidence that the place where the anchor changed was Germany. Germany, 5 years ago, moved ideologically from a sort of philosophy of order liberalismus to something which is more intervention of collective choices, be they at European level, national level, or even regional level. Third point, and last point, I mean, at the end of the day, and you mentioned that, I think what matters for the future, which did not matter as much before, is whether the EU is able to become a power. Now, for a long time, power was an economic issue in terms of dynamics. This has changed. If you look at the planet, geoeconomics have driven this planet for the last 30 or 40 years, at a time where geopolitics were, let's say, reasonably calm, and notably since the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was an important geopolitical turn in that it washed out the rivalry, the ideological rivalry between capitalism and communism. But it's true that we've entered, since, let's say, 2010, into a different balance between the geoeconomic shaping factors and the geopolitical economic factors. The main trigger for that, in my view, is China, because that's the moment where, with the arrival of Xi Jinping and the consequences of the 2008 crisis in reflating the state-owned sector in China, China's course towards economic reform shifted. They roughly, since Deng Xiaoping decided that China should reintegrate the world to the arrival of Xi Jinping, the trajectory was a sort of convergence, of course, a very long-term convergence, but a convergence. From 2010 on, it shifted. This somehow coincided and reinforced the feeling of the sort of Thucydidean trap in the US that China was becoming a threat, a rival, not just a rival, but a threat, which is when this shift happened, and that's, let's say, for the last 15 years, with a growing trend of antagonism, which, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has elevated at a higher level of geopolitical confrontation. Not that we did not have wars before, but most of these wars were domestic wars. There was no real international crisis since the Cuba crisis in the 60s. There were, which, by the way, did not result in a war because of the efficiency of nuclear deterrence. This time, we are back to a planet where we have a huge fundamental war, which is back to the Middle Ages, about territory. The intention of Russia is to invade, control, absorb Ukraine. And this, of course, triggers many other geopolitical tensions, starting, by the way, with some of those I mentioned in my sort of rapid balance between good news and less good news, because it's absolutely clear, and many Europeans have to understand that whatever attitude we have vis-à-vis the US, and we've had good reasons with Trump, for instance, to have, let's say, more reserve than in the past, if NATO was not there, i.e. if the US was not there, Ukraine would be a Russian province today. And this is a major geopolitical realization which takes us way beyond the sort of nitty-gritty of economic integration. And this takes us back to, in my view, the fundamental issue, which is whether the European Union, as an economic integration process, a geo-economic integration process, is or not able to move to what makes a power, which is both economic force and political power. And the issue of whether the EU becomes enough of a geopolitical animal to be able to exercise power, i.e. influence its environment, and be able to cope with influences which others want to have on Europe, this, I think, is the key question. And the answer to this question is partly economic. I agree with that. I don't see a world in 50 or 100 years where the strength of your economy would not matter. Because this has to do with levels of living and with the adhesion of the population to economic and political systems. But I do not see either a world in 50 years from now which would be similar to the one we had in the 90s, where geoeconomics would trump geoeconomics would trump geopolitics. I think we are now in a period, for a variety of reasons, where the balance has changed and where the challenge for the EU is to move at this level of geopolitical integration, which is very complex. I've always, not always, when I was young, when I was 10 years I spent with Delors as chief of staff at the time, my belief was that the founding fathers were right when they thought that economic integration would ipso facto create political integration. That there was a sort of continuum between economic integration and political integration. This is not true. Moving from economic integration to political integration entails a different process, not least because economics are rational, politics are passional, and it's about representations, it's about emotions, it's about imagination, much more than economic integration. And this is the real challenge. To come back to my point about the impact of Ukraine, it may be that as a result, the imagination of Europeans that they belong to the same political space will be much stronger than before. But I'm not sure about that.
Well, basically, I think that even in the disagreement that you pointed out, I think that we are in agreement because you recognize that the integration in services is very limited, and the services are really very determinant in terms of the sizes of the economy, and of course for these developments of the innovation. And also, I don't deny, on the contrary, I would support that the integration in general was very successful in economic terms, and it produced really very, very good results. So Europe today is much better than it was before the integration, even in economic terms. So since we are in agreement, so I will not I will not go to comment what you said, because I'm mostly in agreement with everything. And before I returning to Europe, just two quick notes about two things that has to do with the rest of the world. One is you mentioned that during the Cold War we prevented having a nuclear war. That was a success. But there was, just to come back to my point of the events and the problem of the events, very few people know that we were indeed at the verge of a nuclear war by accident during the Cuba crisis, because there was a Russian submarine equipped with nuclear missiles that was, well, in deep sea, and that's without being able to contract with headquarters, so without knowing the developments that were in course, and suddenly they started to be attacked by the blockade that has been instituted by the American Navy. They detected the submarine. They started to shoot charges upon it, and so the submarine saw itself attacked, and there was an internal dispute. They were willing to shoot the nuclear missile, but then because the use of the nuclear weapons requires an agreement with several people, at least one of those persons was in a disagreement, and then so we were prevented. So fortunately, we were prevented from having a nuclear encounter at that time. The second note is about China, about Xi, and I'm not going to develop that much, but just to say this. I think that Xi is very detrimental to China, at least if we look at the development of China since Deng Xiaoping, which I believe Deng Xiaoping was a very notable strategist, and I think that what Xi is doing is going to be detrimental for the development of China, and because it's going to be detrimental to the development of China, it's going to be a danger to the world, because China at some point will fail their expectation to meet their expectations, and then when you start having difficulties at home, you always try to get a foreign enemy in order to unify the people around you. But these are just two lateral comments. Coming to Europe and to strategic autonomy, which I think it's a matter that has been on the agendas for a long time. Basically, and as you know, the issue of strategic autonomy is basically a French issue. So it was from the French that the issue was started, and it can date back to de Gaulle, and it is very much centered on the military power, mostly on military issues. Although I believe that even if we want to talk about strategic autonomy, we have to look at all sources of power. And basically, the strategic autonomy has to do with the capabilities. Mm-hmm. So you have the autonomy that your capabilities allow you to have. Therefore, if Europe wants to have more autonomy, it has to build up the capabilities for that purpose. And Europe has to choose what are the fields where the autonomy is more relevant than the others. And eventually, in the military field, might not be the most relevant field where the autonomy in Europe is required. Definitely, Europe needs to be stronger, militarily speaking, but I don't know how much strong Europe should be, because if we imagine that Europe can be a military power able to compete with the United States and other blocs like this, I'm not sure if this is going to be an element of safety in Europe or if it is going to be an element of insecurity for the world. So as long as we are protected by the nuclear umbrella of the United States, I think that Europe is quite safe. And of course, it has to develop more capabilities because it has to share more in its own defense, even in terms of the occupation of the territory, the European territory. Of course, Europe cannot depend on the presence of the American troops as their protectors. So Europe has to put more meat on the bones of this element. And what are the ways? I think that this avenue of strengthening the military power of Europe, but with limits, might be perhaps the avenue that would produce the political integration. Because if we start with the idea of political integration per se, eventually we will find many resistances, as it has happened up to now. But if we need to strengthen the European defense, I think it would not be also very comfortable, even for the security of Europe, if that strengthening of the military power is done at the national level, which means if it is based on the national military strengths, then you can say, okay, but we are in a peaceful environment, Europe will not find, we are all friends. Yes, we are friends today. But then circumstances produce events. And sometimes the events made with a purpose might generate unwilling circumstances, undesirable circumstances that can, by themselves, trigger actions that are undesirable to occur. So this means that I think the way that Europe should really progress in terms of becoming military strong should be through a true European power, by integrating the military capabilities into a true European military power. But to do that, you need to integrate politically, because you need to have a political level to control those military instruments. And therefore, so that would really create the conditions for an easier acceptance of a further political integration. But for people to accept the political integration, eventually people would need to see more economic and financial integration, which means that the economic union needs to be completed in order for this full circle to be also completed. So I believe that these events that take place at geopolitical level and that trigger the need of military strengthening could be really the instrument for a further and eventually faster integration of Europe into a political entity. Now, how politically integrated it should be or not, I will leave that. Coming back to the economy, the economic powers and the possibility to be relevant, and as you have said quite rightly, so Europe needs to be a source of power. So it needs to have power in the different fronts, including in the economic front. So it needs to be an economic power, and to be an economic power, a relevant economic power, it cannot be an empty space in terms of technology, which means that eventually, he has to look at the sources that can produce economic power more than just to the levels of the wealth. Just to quote a European author, a German author, not of the same persuasion of the more recent ideologies in Germany regarding the economic working, which is List, and he said that power of producing wealth is infinitely more important than wealth itself, which means that the capabilities, and once again, the capabilities come to strategic autonomy, so Europe should really create the conditions to be a producer of wealth in every front. And coming back to the issue of innovation, and in particular digital developments, I forgot to mention a very important element. When I mentioned what was amiss in Europe and what was at fault, I forgot to mention a very important element, which is the financial market. Financial market is perhaps one of the biggest weaknesses of Europe in terms of fostering the development of a stronger economy, of stronger corporations, and stronger capabilities of innovation, of being up to date with this digital transformation. We have a very fragmented financial market. The other day, because I chair the Portuguese Banking Association, so we are members of the European Banking Association, and in the last meeting there was a presentation, and someone showed a graph, a diagram with how the American market, the financial market is organized, just capital market, how it is organized, so very few squares and rectangles, and it showed Europe, and it is a multitude of small rectangles, small squares, and of course, looking at that slide, we understand that it's impossible to develop Europe without disentangling that combination of very small institutions, and we really need a very strong capital markets that can provide the capital necessary for the startups, for the companies that need to develop and that need to develop on themselves, and not just starting as startups. They start here in Europe, and then they have to move to the United States to be able to do the next steps. So the development of the financial market in Europe, the integration of the financial market, which also requires the finalization of the banking union, is some steps that are amiss, and from my point of view, are urgent if Europe wants to succeed in the near future.
I started working with Portugal in 1985, when we arrived in Brussels with the law, at the time where the accession negotiation was to be finished. And I've been following developments here since in different capacities. I think it's a rather formidable example of a country benefiting from European integration. I think if you ask an average European about Portugal, they will say it's been a big European success. And I think this matters. And by the way, this is reflected in the level of support for European integration, which you find in the Eurobarometer, if you compare it to Austria or France, not Belgium, but even Italy. So I think the past is a period where European integration helped Portugal accelerating its economic and social development. The question is, now that Portugal is, on average, on a much more mature part of the European standard of living, and the relative position of Portugal will increase with further enlargements, and we have to factor this in. The question is, what is the European strategy of Portugal? Where does Portugal intend to accelerate, deepen European integration? Where, for a variety of reasons, does it have a different position on integration than, let's say, the Netherlands or Germany? This, I think, is the issue. I think Portugal is now in a position to outline a Portuguese European vision other than it's good for Portugal. And I think this is the challenge. And I recognize that it's something which necessitates a lot of thinking. And I know a number of young people in the political arena who are thinking in these terms. But my answer to your question is, I think it's time for Portugal to forge its own vision of the future of Europe, what it should be like, and then to align its behavior as a member of the European Union, whether it's in the Commission, in the Council, or in the Parliament.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentations. I would like to hear your views, Pascal, on the enlargement precisely. Because I see that we are being very enthusiastic about the prospects of a further enlargement into the East, and particularly in receiving the Ukraine. But you commented on the need for Europe to become, if I may say so, less dysfunctional and capable to cope with the challenges of further integration and becoming more than a economic power, a geopolitical power. So it's very difficult within the European Union we have to gain the consensus to move in that direction, which I think, by the way, is the one that favors Portugal. How do you see, before solving issues about what European Union we want to be, making promises or committing to enlargements into the East with a country which is at war and probably, as you said, will continue to be in a very difficult situation with Russia? So this is the point I would like you to hear your views.
That's, of course, a big question. And by the way, I put it in two defining difference between, at the end of the day, a stronger or a weaker outcome for the European Union. I personally believe enlargements have never weakened the European Union. If you look at the long term, it has been a strength. It has helped the European Union growing. It has created a competitive shock which benefited acceding countries, but also led older countries to adjust. And whereas I accept conventional wisdom that the more we are, the more difficult it is to take decisions, I don't agree with that. We have institutions that have allowed to absorb this question of a number, except in two areas, which are tax policy, which remains unanimity, and I regret it. But this is not because of enlargement. If you want names among the countries who oppose fiscal integration, most of them are in the old members, and some even in the very old members. So it's not a problem with enlargement. The other area is foreign and security policy, and on this, I'm on a more conservative school than some of my colleagues. I'm not sure that the solution is to vote qualified majority on a security policy. At the end of the day, security and defense is about death. It's not about a currency. It's not about making markets more efficient. It's about sending people with the risk that they come back dead. And this is not something which you decide on a qualified majority, in my view. There has to be a long process of identification of, you mentioned it rightly, and the defense and security issue is also an economic issue. It's an issue of capability, but it's very much an issue of mental capability. It's an issue of, do we share the same nightmares? And any anthropologist will tell you that sharing nightmares is a pretty complex anthropological venture. So I think this time, notably with the countries that are on the door of enlargement, starting with Ukraine, I personally believe, and I participate in a series of works, that we should have a more, let's say, progressive process rather than this sort of all or nothing, which is you have to tick 55 boxes, and as long as you haven't ticked the 55 boxes, the door is closed. And this is a very painful process because ticking the boxes basically is when a country accepts to conform to the existing. I mean, nothing like a negotiation. I mean, I was EU Trade Commissioner when we enlarged to a number of non-European countries. It was nothing of a negotiation. They knew that they would have to join the EU external tariff and the EU trade policy at the moment they would join. So pretending it is a negotiation is absolutely wrong. It's a one-sided process where a country has to tick a number of boxes in order to have its certificate. This is a political and psychological process which has been problematic. Maybe not immediately, but it has left traces that there are the dominants that decide and the others that abide. And if you want to understand what's happening in Hungary or Poland, for instance, and if you listen to the real local analysts, there is a part of that. So I think we have to move to something which is more progressive while recognizing, and this will not change, that the cement of EU economic integration is law. And law does not have a variable geometry. Article 1 of law is the law is the same for everybody. And this fundamental legal reality will remain. The problem is, can we phase in the various elements of belonging to the European Union? Again, there are there is quite a lot of brainstorming on this. And I think we should learn from where it worked well or less well in the past, while recognizing that the reality, and we alluded to that in the previous conversation, was the only incontestable geopolitical achievements of the European Union has been its enlargement, not least because people want to join. And the reason we want to join is back to what we mentioned. But it's going to be tough. And the reason why this huge sort of field of future of the EU was opened is because Mr. Putin pushed on the attack button. It was the inevitable consequence of that, whereas I have participated in discussions about Ukraine for a number of years, including when I was DG of the WTO, where I helped them joining the World Trade Organization. The notion that they would belong to the European Union was very, very far away. It's not. And this is a big shift.
You have said that the UK leaving the EU was probably the biggest, or if maybe the sole regression since the creation of the EU. Now they're going through their hangover and of their period of love affair with populism. Do you see any chance, not to rejoin in the short term, but maybe to have trade deals and parallel deals with the EU for the UK? And do you think politically the EU will be favorable to any such approach, coming back somehow?
Overall, I deeply regret Brexit. I know that the case can be made that in what's happened since, and notably in the way we reacted to a number of crises, including the COVID crisis, we might not have crossed this red line of an EU whole debt if UK had remained. So it's not, it's a nuanced appreciation. Second, and I share this news with you, I just saw this afternoon the result of the first poll in UK that was done on what would be the vote today if they had to vote. Previously, there was no poll on the vote. There were polls on whether they thought it was a good thing or not. And the result of the poll is, if there was a poll today, 60% would vote for Remain and 30% would vote for Leave, which says something about their own appreciation of what happened. Now, that's the past, and I deeply regret it. I think it was a big political mistake from Cameron to sort of surrender to the right of the Conservative Party, who had made this the sort of element of pressure. What is decisive for the future is not the attitude of the EU. The EU is neutral. It's not a problem for the EU, by the way. Of course, a relationship with UK is more important than a relationship with Norway or with Switzerland or with Liechtenstein, of course. The problem is on their side. And the equation is extremely simple. How much do they want to diverge from EU norms and standards? If the answer is big divergence, the frontier will be thick. If the answer is small divergence, the frontier will be thin. The fundamental reality is that what matters is not that the UK left the European Union or left the customs union. What they left was the internal market. And the moment you leave the internal market, you have a border. And by the way, we have to remember that we had borders within the European Union for many, many years after we decided to unite. We had a customs union. Of course, we did not have tariffs. We did not have anti-dumping duties against Germany or Italy. But we had borders because borders are about regulatory discrepancies. And it's only at the moment where we harmonize enough of our rules, or we accepted to mutually recognize that, if beer is good for the Germans in Germany and for the Belgians in Belgium, then Belgian beer should be good for the Germans and the other way around, which is pretty no-brainer. But it's only at that time that we remove borders. So exiting the internal market is creating a border. Creating a border is creating frictions. And creating frictions is a cost, and this is where we are now. So the answer, the immediate answer to your question for the years to come is whether they want or not to diverge. No.
Thank you also for your excellent reflection and comments. I would like to raise a question on the relationship between France and Germany. You have highlighted that some tensions have become more apparent in terms of energy policy, in terms of fiscal policy, and in terms of security and defense. This tension is a key issue or solving this tension seems to me it's a key issue for the development of the Union and for the definition of consistent policies. We see in France a rather turbulent political process, and not so much in Germany. But in any case, in France, the perspective of a possibility of the far right and Marine Le Pen to have a win in the next elections would raise an enormous challenge. Can you have some reflections and comments on the possibility of going further on these topics?
I'll do that, but I would be interested in your opinion, because being French, my view may be a bit biased. First, I believe that a Franco-German alliance is a necessary condition for European integration. It's not sufficient, but the reason why it is necessary is because of the size of these two countries, and B, more importantly, probably, because they are so different. Then when they agree on something, then it's a magnet for the rest of the European countries. We have very different political systems. One is a typical parliamentary system, another is a typical presidential system, which creates a bias which always has to be softened, usually with time between the leaders in the two countries. The present situation is a situation where the French European policy is much clearer than the German one because of their coalition system and because of all the problems that the invasion of Ukraine creates to Germany, which is much more challenged in the way it works as a country, notably economically, than France. The big strength of the Germany for a long time suddenly become weaknesses, whereas on the economic side, the French have not always been at the right level, so we are in a way less damaged. Short term, the problem is more on the German side, because they have a problem in running this very strange coalition with a Social Democrat Party who remains fundamentally very pacifist, Greens which have totally changed their mind and are now sort of more innovative part, and a liberal part in the coalition whose problem is only to survive as a party in the next elections. That's the short term. Bit longer term, your question is, I think, absolutely right. If Madame Le Pen was to be elected in France, that would be a big shock on the French attitude to Europe. Not that she would Frexit, no, but she would not be a Meloni. Meloni is transatlantic and does not want to sever Italy from the benefits of European integration. Madame Le Pen is not transatlantic. Like the extreme left, they basically want to leave NATO. And her tradition is much more anti-European, although, and that's in a way good news, although from the political point of view it's debatable, the reality is that if you look at what's happened for the last 15 years, the extreme right in Europe is not anymore, on average, anti-European. And on this, Le Pen is an exception. So the extreme right in Europe has swallowed the Gramscian leadership of Mr. Orban, whose point has been, and this was very innovative at the time, we, extreme right, do not want to leave Europe. We want to change Europe. And this is a major ideological shift, which the traces of which you can find in most extreme right. And the problem now in the European overall landscape is whether the extreme right will eat the right or whether the right will eat the extreme right. And the issue is an ideological issue, but whether you belong to the Union or not is not a major issue. And by the way, we have a test of this in what, if you look at the preparations for the next European elections, and you see whether the EPP and, let's say, the other more right parties will fabricate a coalition or not. So I do recognize that if she was to be elected, and I'm not among those who wish it, I think it's well known, and I think the game is still extremely open. 2027 is a long time from now, and in politics, but it would be a major problem for the European integration. I've been a bit long on the answer, but I would be interested by your answer.
Well, you are much better informed than myself because you are at the core. So I will try to give a less informed perspective, but from far away. Well, first of all, I believe that there will be inevitably a kind of understanding because the future of Europe depends on that. Because, I mean, if they cannot integrate themselves, so there is no integration for Europe, there is no political integration for Europe. Most of the differences, they lie on historical reasons, on historical reasons, even with cultural grounds. After the war, Germany was limited in its possibility to recover. I mean, its power. It was very limited by the treaties, by the agreements with the Allied forces, and it decided. It found out that the way for Germany to develop was to integrate into Europe. So the development of Germany, so its strategic culture developed through the integration of Europe, and Germany always saw itself as a part of Europe, or a part of an integrated Europe. On the other hand, I think that France ended the Second World War with the trauma and with the nightmare of becoming irrelevant, becoming an irrelevance between the Anglo-Saxon Empire on one hand, then the Soviet Empire on the other hand, and eventually what would be the future of Germany. And so it lived with this kind of fear, and because of that it tried always to affirm its uniqueness, its differentiation, its source of power, and it's why also, as I said before, the idea of strategic autonomy is much more a French cultural issue than anything else. Germany is not concerned with, at least in terms of the discussions, has not been very much concerned about this strategic autonomy, because Germany was always saw itself, even to defend itself from itself, to be integrated in Europe, and military to be integrated in NATO, not to be a military power per se, but to be integrated in NATO. So the idea of integration is quite natural to the post-war Germany. Having said this, and as I said, I believe that both end up by recognizing that each of them would be irrelevant in a bipolar or multipolar world divided. So by themselves they would lose importance, and the only way to get importance is through Europe. And to do that, I believe that they will tread more closeness, and eventually, as I said before, if these developments, the geopolitical developments, force Europe to get military strengthening, and this leads to European integration, to political integration, and so on, I believe that France and Germany will have to come to terms to that. How is that going to be done? Well, I always, when I see a very big pickle like this, I always remember a story, which is, I don't know if you know, how two hedgehogs make love. Treading very carefully. And I think this is what is going to be. So they have to prevent the divergences to widen, to get to develop what can make them closer. But we'll be traversing a time when these tensions that have erupted in Europe, that have given rise to populisms, these are perhaps the biggest difficulty. But this is the difficulty not only to the relationship between Germany and France, but for the whole European integration, because this is an element of disintegration, it's an element of separation. So this is perhaps the major threat to that, because if that becomes overcome, and of course that requires common policies to be done, I think it will become easier also to find common ground for Germany and France, because they will end up by seeing that if Europe is to succeed, they have to be seen themselves as Siameses. They are inseparable. They are inseparable. If they get separated, Europe will die.
Well, we have to conclude. Before they become very metaphoric, because you know how people do love with it. Thank you to you both. There is. I was trying to say, you know, José asked me to wrap up, and I said, the optimists leave the room with some very solid arguments to remain optimists, and they forget the pessimism that some other people can have. The pessimists will also have very good grounds to remain pessimists. So they are a perfect duo. They should have a show, a permanent talk show, because at the end of the day, everybody leaves very happy and very persuaded that they are in with the wrong approach. The next conference is the 31st of September. Please do come. It's globalization. It's going to be very challenging. The speakers are very challenging too. And Pascal, merci. C'était très gentil de venir au Portugal. Je sais qu'il adore le Portugal. Alors, enfin, on a toujours une raison pour le faire venir. E também muito obrigado, Vítor. Acho que todos agradecemos. Um aplauso para eles.
Obrigado.